Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 719, September 16th, 1985. If you wish copies of bibliography for these particular broadcasts, write to me, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Mae Brussell, Maebrussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, and give the date of the broadcast or which one it was you heard, or else you can say with a self-enclosed envelope. Be sure to stamp it. I'll take the month of July or August, and I'll send you the sheets with the sources of information that I'm using on the air. A magazine in the Soviet Union called New Times has just come out with a new issue. Part of it was reprinted in the Los Angeles Herald and Examiner this past week, September the 12th. The article talks about the murder of Samantha Smith, the people in the Soviet Union, the powers that be that published this magazine, say that the CIA was responsible for her accident. And I had that item on the air when the airplane crash first took place. But even though the lead story in the LA Herald is Samantha Smith killed by CIA, when you read down two paragraphs, the second paragraph, they went on to say to reinforce these rumors, the KGB-run weekly, The New Times, said that American television personality Jessica Savitch was done in because some people were angry over her program about the emigres leaving the Soviet Union and then being disillusioned on the outside. Well, Svetlana Stalin went back to the Soviet Union for the same reason, and even if the writers were KGB, I don't see what difference would it make. We have over 400 news people in the United States that are CIA, and this was verified by the Senate congressional hearings in the 70s. They claim that two people set up her murder, Vladimir Bukovsky, Bukovsky, and Rabbi Meir Kahane from Israel, former head of the Jewish Defense League, and that she was irking the Zionists with the kind of program that she was having, and that these strong anti-Soviet persons killed her because she was hinting that life in the Soviet Union may not be so bad for some people as those who get out. Next week I'll update this because I do get the New Times in a couple of days. That issue will come to the House. Interestingly enough, I always believed that Jessica Savitch was murdered because of the TV show she did, public broadcasting, on the murder of Roberta Calvi. There were so many primary witnesses to the events of the Masonic Lodge and the scandals in Italy, the gun running and the narcotics traffic and so forth. But when she did that particular film, it was made in London, but she narrated part of it, introduced it, and closed it. It was a very powerful movie, pointing finger also to Francesco Pazienza, who is in jail in New York and who works with the CIA Defense Department agent Michael Adine, close to Ronald Reagan and so forth. And I felt they had the power to murder her. And if it were the CIA, it seems to me that the most powerful motive would be to silence her because of the Vatican and not because of Zionism or Israel. But I'll read the article and share that with you and then go into the way the Los Angeles Herald covered this story, which is so highly slanted that if you read the KGB, you can't believe them. That's ridiculous. John Judge, who used to live in Philadelphia, lives in Washington, D.C. I gave you his name and address last week to send for tapes or printed material from him, has done a lot of work on the murder of Jessica Savitch, and Charles Spear keeps working to try and expose the clear-cut murder of Jessica Savitch. Just September the 9th, before this article came out in the Soviet Union, he had written to Leslie Stahl, who's on Face the Nation, CBS, and asked for information about the murder of 15 women, journalists or witnesses to the assassinations or other dirty tricks, and one of them among those was Jessica Savitch. He's always trying to find out what happened to her, and of course many of the other women too. We know what happened, but there are other pieces of information that have yet to be filled in. Last week on broadcast 718, I was talking about several mass murders. Henry Lee Lucas from El Paso, who claims 360 people, and Mahem Kramis from Dallas, and also lives in Irving, Texas, who said he killed 100 people. And then made a few comments and haven't done too much on the Los Angeles, San Francisco Night Stalker, our wonderful California mass murderers that we get out here, with the exception of just one or two. All those kinds of people are coming out of California. And he also came from El Paso, Texas, like Henry Lee Lucas. And Ted Koppel had a broadcast this week on Nightline talking about rock music, and do groups like AC/DC influence people like the Night Stalker to be murderers? Well, this is the typical Ronald Reagan, Edwin Meese shenanigans with the Defense Department during the 60s and 70s when Reagan was governor from 66 to 74, and trying to blame the Manson murders or Charles Manson on rock music, even though Charles Watson, the Boy Scout, the devout Christian, did the killings. Manson wasn't in that home. But before Reagan became president and was inaugurated in 1981, I was warning on our broadcast that music again would be used as an excuse to stop messages. There are messages in music. Not all music has messages, but some music does, and music is very important. And when the Night Stalker articles came out, they tried to say that Ricardo Ramirez was influenced by Satan and the devil, and is music passing on the message of Satan and the devil that causes in the minds of these people to do murders. The discussion, of course, now is about Madonna and Cyndi Lauper and Prince, Michael Jackson. Are they causing some kind of freakish behavior in the youth today? Never mentioning the war movies or Rambo, wiping out people, blood everywhere, or Red Dawn, or The Fear of the World, or just plain murder for no reason, such as Alfred Hitchcock. Nobody ever stands in front of Psycho and protests that it has influenced people to murder, which we know it has because they said so. Now, the interesting thing is that in studying the John Birch Society, I've been reading a lot about John Birch, and I just came across a new book, The Secret File on John Birch, by James and Marty Heffley. It came out in 1980. And they tell about his struggle with Christian fundamentalism when he went to school. He was born in Georgia, Macon, Georgia, and was trained with a fellow from Texas. And he was very much influenced by the devil. He was a troublemaker at school. He's the fellow who was murdered in China right after the war and became, in quotes, the first casualty of World War III. He was closely associated with Alfred Wiedemeyer and General Chennault, worked for Chennault as a translator. And in this book, it tells about John Birch, the person who was in college. And it says, while John Birch was in college, he was preaching in Baptist schools. He took passages from the scripture and he would explain them. He was hired in a church in Augusta, Georgia, and worked there. And then he took on at his university a fellow named Dr. Freeman, and caused what this book describes as a controversy. They called their town another monkey town because the professor was charged with heresy. And the book on John Birch says, John claimed that Dr. Freeman had denied the reality of demon possession as recorded in the gospel, and said that the biblical writers had been limited to first-century ignorance of medical and psychiatric science. So he was arguing and trying to get a professor from the university fired because, for a sure thing, there is the demon possession and the devil and Satan, and John Birch, the hero for whom the John Birch Society was named, believed firmly in this. And if AC/DC sings about the devil or Satan, or if the Night Stalker talks about the devil or Satan, the source of this was and still is the Bible, that causes more murders and more mass murders than any single song or group or all the groups put together, and that's for sure. Now, going to another subject just quickly, because many of you watched the program 60 Minutes. This last Sunday night, they had a program on the brains behind Jesse Helms' political campaign. Helms ran for Senate in 1972. He's off and running and wants to take over and have people buy CBS. He's the man behind Ted Turner's goal for CBS. They interviewed Tom Ellis from the National Congressional Club. They've only raised $50 million to support people in Congress who believe their conservative views and knock out the people who don't. And then another person was introduced, a Jim Kane and a Carter Rand. But the big man of all the ideas, and this was really impressive, is a man named Bob Harris, who's 26 years old. He has cystic fibrosis. He weighs 70 pounds. He's bedridden, and they call him a one-man think tank. And of his 70 pounds, the tremendous amount of brains and organization, he can't talk. He conveys through an instrument, and his mother translates what he's saying. He talks through a tube and makes noises with his voice, which are translated to the things he has to say. He reads newspapers every day. He watches the CBS News. When Governor Hunt ran against Jesse Helms in 1984, that was the most expensive election that we had ever seen in the United States in a Senate. But this man, this handful, almost in a fetal position, a little tiny shriveled body with a head, is totally brilliant. And he took all the speeches of Hunt and read them, the governor of North Carolina, and he took all the contradictions and the different statements, and he showed that he was made opinion on one subject one day and one on the other. And he knows what he's doing. He's a hard worker. He's a conservative. And the interesting thing is that he goes to the Conservative Party, to Jesse Helms, and the Republican Party, and they take him on their staff. He was in a wheelchair at the time. But you have to give them a lot of credit, because the conservatives will take old ladies, they'll take young people, they will take people that are having suffered or suffering from physical handicaps. And what they got from him was a combined intelligence think tank greater than all the brains of these individuals, three other people shown on the screen, and Jesse Helms himself. And I'm sure that the Democrats wouldn't do this, never have, wouldn't think of it, and they consider themselves so liberal, but there's just as much snobbishness and hierarchy in that Democratic Party. This is why I dropped out of it, per se, is that they don't welcome a new idea. Now, I had identified with what he was doing. In fact, I talked to one of my closest friends after the broadcast, and I said, this is the work that I'm doing. I have the advantage of being able to talk and write and even having a radio program. I have the disadvantage of people not hearing it and not knowing what to do with it. He has the physical disadvantage, but he's with people who understand how to use his brains. I've put out enough material in the last 14 years, this is my 15th year on the air, to get many criminals out of office, to show how the President of the United States was murdered, or the candidate who would be president, or rock musicians, or writers, or people from the theater. But this material isn't used. He takes what is in the news and he analyzes it, and it is indeed very accurate. Never television news, but the printed news. He watches the TV in the evening, just CBS, because that's the one they want to get out. But I've published articles, and I've been on the air and talked about things that would have helped the peace movement, could help the blacks, could help the Jews, and could do a lot of things in this country to stave off purposeful giving diseases, whether it's cancer or even AIDS and mind control. But this information is available, and what I do is extract it exactly as Bob Harris does it, except, as I say, I'm throwing it out there to people who can't receive it, and he is sending it out to people who are using it. And they took a campaign that didn't look like Jesse Helms had a chance. He took 400 articles or had flashes of the opponent of Jesse Helms, Governor Hunt, and he showed how he had an opinion on one subject, and the next day he had another, and how it changed. We could take material on corruption in government, on the wasting of money, polluting of water, of land, of breaking laws, of breaking down the Justice Department, and put these people on the defensive. It's not going to happen because for some reason or other, the connection between Helms and his men and Harris was just right. And by the time I would ever connect with the people who understand what I'm saying, it's already too late. The money and the power is behind those people. And if you haven't figured it out yet, nobody's going to figure out in the next 20 years, because there's been more information available than I, can explain. And I have seen material I've even had to throw out so much and kept a lot. And it's like keeping all the tools to build a house and somebody's sitting next door with the lumber and doesn't know how to get started. It's a shame, but that's a fact of life. And I really appreciated seeing on 60 Minutes this person and what he could do. And not only what he could do, but the partnership of who he was doing it with and how they used him and understood what he's saying, and they use him every day. Now, to another one of my favorite subjects, the papers last week, the LA Times and San Jose Mercury, carried the great Henry Kissinger syndicated always these big stories. They're not just newspaper articles, they're full half pages. The latest Kissinger story, Soviets on Star Wars. Don't compromise with them. This is very important that you don't give up your Strategic Defense Initiative, signed by Henry Kissinger, September the 8th, 85. And there's a big quote in a box with a picture of Sir Henry. It says, "How the Reagan administration handles its own initiative is one of the seminal decisions of the decade." And he's right. The seminal decision of the decade. I looked up seminal to see what this German Kissinger was meaning. It says it is referring to or consisting of a seed or semen, and the seed of the Star Wars was planted. That semen was planted in 1943, as I said before, when they arranged the paperclip scientists and Galen to come to the United States. He said, containing of contributing the seeds of later development. And that again goes back to that great movie, The Serpent's Egg, that Ingmar Bergman made about the seeds of fascism being planted in the late 1919, 1920. And then by 1933, all the people were in place for Adolf Hitler via the process of political assassination and mind control. And he says, how the administration handles this is the seminal decision of the decade. Why is it so important, the Star Wars of the decade? Because that is your first strike offensive against the Soviet Union. In fact, I mentioned several months ago how Lieutenant General Daniel Graham walked out of a Star Wars meeting when it was revealed that it would be a first strike initiative. Now, Henry Kissinger is a person from the inside working with Fritz Kramer, Daniel Graham, Edward Teller, and the people pushing this Star Wars. There is a revolutionary change in weapon technology. He's right. He's selling this. Security has always been equated with what he says massive nuclear devastation. Now he's arguing we can't have nuclear bombs. That's crazy. Henry Kissinger is behind the MAD, the Mutually Assured Destruction. He built atomic bombs to the point where they are prolificated all over the world and placed all over the world. Then, to push the Star Wars, he and they say, oh, we can't have those bombs. We need something different than the bombs. Take those atomic bombs away. Give us our Star Wars. So he's talking about a revolution of weapons in this article. He's saying that mass devastation by nuclear bombs is behind all this. Then he says we can't rely on nuclear weapons and the global yearning to banish nuclear apocalypse. You can't rely on these two things, the global yearning to banish nuclear apocalypse. He set that up for us, and now we have a global yearning. Then Kissinger goes on, the policy of security with massive nuclear devastation is losing relevance. It made us bankrupt, and it's losing relevance, and it's going to other countries besides us in the Soviets, such as Pakistan, South Africa, Argentina, maybe Gaddafi. The devastation is going to be bad, and he helped pass them around. Then he says if we push the specter of apocalyptic casualties too far, the democratic people, the public, he calls them the democratic publics, will sooner or later retreat to pacifism and unilateral disarmament. Heavens forbid, Henry Kissinger, that if we go too far with the fear of all of us being dead and spreading the weapons that you wanted as Secretary of State and head of the National Security Agency, we might be pushed so far with the fear of dying that we even go to pacifism. Well, that's worse than death for Henry Kissinger and Daniel Graham and Edward Teller. If you want a translation, he means if you're going to get your bottom bombed off or burned to death, you might start thinking about peace and not making weapons, which is impossible for him and the Vatican and the evangelical anticipation of their prophecies to wipe out the Antichrist. We can't do that. And so Henry Kissinger says the Soviet strategy is to stigmatize efforts to devise less nihilistic alternatives. The Soviet Union have a strategy. They're going to put a stigma on these ways of fighting war if you're using atomic bombs and get you to be doing away with the weapons and looking for peace. And they will devise a less nihilistic alternative. Translated means, what if the Soviets want to live, and come up with another suggestion, okay? The Soviet Union knows, number one, that Star Wars is a first strike offensive. Number two, the Soviet Union knows that we're arming ourselves on the ocean and land and all over for World War II. And I mentioned some of that and John Lehman last week. The Soviet Union knows that Daniel Graham walked out of that Star Wars meeting when they talked about a first strike. Not that he didn't go along with it, but that it was revealed. The Soviet Union knows that since World War II, before it was over, through their correspondence to Franklin Roosevelt and so forth, and watching Allen Dulles and William Donovan, that the whole paperclip operation those scientists brought to the United States was to conquer the USSR and to conquer the world. They know all that, and they know that the Star Wars is not the lesser of two evils. They're not holding out because it is easier to do Star Wars than atomic wars. They know that that isn't the reason Henry Kissinger is talking about, to have a nice clean fight up in the clouds, floating around on those clouds. They know that it's preparing for a war. We'll have the ground troops and the invasion. We have new tanks and weapons and neutron bombs to save buildings and not people. The Soviet Union doesn't want the Star Wars because they know what it will do, and they're willing to have a mutual destruction if you want it, but they're not going to be defeated by Star Wars. Henry Kissinger said the efforts of the Soviet Union to stigmatize this Star Wars job must be firmly turned back. He said the United States and Russia will meet in Geneva, the teams for so-called discussions about some way to try and get along before we blow each other up. That's what it's about. That there will be anxiety among the democracies because democracies want to show progress. You know, Kissinger is so cynical. Remember where he came from, Germany, and when he came, and who he worked with, and who he is. I remind you every week, he's so rotten. Then he says the United States will exploit the mood and start impetus to wreck the Star Wars. They're exploiting the mood to have peace. The truth is we're bankrupt. We're morally bankrupt. We're financially bankrupt. This is a sick society, and Kissinger should have been hung up and kicked out when he did the Cambodia bombings without telling Congress. Now, Kissinger, this is that quotation in the box, how the administration handles its own initiative as it moves toward the summit involves one of the seminal decisions of the decade. And he's not kidding. This is the seed of total destruction of fascism over any other way of life if you give these people the way. They know what went on in the past with the Nazis and the Americans. The Soviet Union knows that in 1966, when Ronald Reagan became governor, he was taken to Lawrence Livermore Lab with Edward Teller, where they were planning this great big bang. They know that Reagan has worked closely with Teller and Kissinger and Daniel Graham, all of them working with the Helionetics firm, making the bombs, big bombs, and getting ready for the Star Wars. High Frontier, which is the office headed by Daniel Graham, shares space with Fritz Kramer, Kissinger's mentor. D'Entente peace talks have always been sabotaged. And now, one more time, we're going into this event where don't be taken by the impetus for peace. Don't let the democracies be fooled by what the Soviet Union say. And who is Henry Kissinger, and how does he get so much power? You know I've talked about this for week after week. Kissinger's mentor, Dr. F.G. Fritz Kramer, sits with Lieutenant General Daniel Graham of High Frontier Star Wars. Incidentally, Graham was the deputy director of the CIA under William Colby, who ran the Phoenix program and the mass murders and tortures and the wiping out of villages in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. The address, again, some of you may not remember, their office, their front for all their activities, Institute on Strategic Trade, 499 South Capitol Street, Suite 404A, Washington, D.C., 20003. Now, getting one brief comment about Henry Kissinger. In Seattle, that trial is going on the Nazi group that want to overthrow the United States, and I mentioned them last week. There was a small article in the LA Herald, September the 14th, Neo-Nazis described plans to assassinate Henry Kissinger. I guess they think being as he's Jewish, they were going to knock him out, not knowing. How could they not know what a wonderful Nazi Kissinger is? But in the trial in Seattle, they said the group had an assassination unit with a contingency plan to kill Kissinger and the nation's 3 major television networks, the heads of them. Well, the heads, those are such monsters. How do you get the heads of the television networks? If William Casey's company bought out ABC, would they kill William Casey? This maybe the Nazis said they're going to kill Kissinger to make him look like a liberal, but this just came out as testimony at the trial. A man named Daw Parmenter II, one of the original members of the Aryan group of the Order that I talked about last week, talked about the plans to kill Kissinger, and they throw his name in there. Now, not unrelated to Kissinger and his friend Fritz Kramer, because they were there at the time, in the Battle of the Bulge, there was a story in the paper this morning, Monday, September 16th, Associated Press story, and also in the Monterey Herald. Veteran defends plans for reunion with the SS. Milwaukee, which is the home base of Senator Joe McCarthy and top Germans that put McCarthy into office, and out of Wisconsin came the efforts to release the Malmedy defendants, including Hitler's Fritz Kramer. Well, out of Milwaukee, there's a group of American war veterans, World War veterans, that are going to meet with Nazi SS division, a Nazi SS division, later in Europe this month. And of course, the division is the 6th Panzer Division of Hitler's SS and Otto Skorzeny and Sepp Dietrich, the 6th SS division. And then this is the joke of it all. They quote Simon Wiesenthal, Nazi hunter. Oh, what a hunting he's been doing. Simon Wiesenthal on Sunday urged members of the U.S. 70th Infantry Division not to attend the annual reunion of the former members of the 6th SS Division. That's the big, bad Panzer Division. Read the Battle of the Bulge. Well, Wiesenthal gave up any authority to speak for anyone after his outright lies about Joseph Mengele. He's just a joke. And he tells them, oh, please don't go to this meeting. Well, I have news for you. They're going there, and there isn't going to stop the 70th Infantry Division a meeting. Here's a quotation. This is a provocation, an absolute provocation, Wiesenthal said in a telephone interview. The SS will use it as a sign of reconciliation. Well, Wiesenthal got a Medal of Honor from Helmut Kohl just a couple of weeks before he went to Bitburg with Ronald Reagan. What does he think that was for, and why did he silence himself, and what kind of reconciliation does he make? Now, the particular veteran who set this up is going for it's a 44-member delegation he's taking, 16-day trip, and he said, we respect the fact that Wiesenthal's group are the hurt parties, but they're not going to change their mind anyway, which means, look, Mr. Jew boy, we don't even care what you say. And he explains that they're going to go back. Mr. Omholt said his group has a meeting every 2 years, which they do. They start in Germany in 1977. And the United States veterans meet with the former SS troopers in the area of Alsace-Lorraine. That's where John DeLorean's mother came from, Alsace-Lorraine. And Daddy then went to work for Ford Motor Company. And this is where the Battle of the Bulge took place in December of 44. That's when 750 million Americans were killed, and William Shire said it was about 75. Wiesenthal said that the groups are going to meet Sunday in Frankfurt, Germany. They're going to a military cemetery near Strasbourg to put flowers, and of course they'll put flowers on the graves of the others. And this veteran arranging the trip said, we may very well meet with them, the SS veterans, on an individual basis. We'll sit at tables and drink beer. And Wiesenthal was crying. The 6th SS Division was organized before the war. It was the elite fighting unit. In 1943-44, it incorporated units of killers who took part in massacres of Jews and other civilians. And this person arranging the trip said, so you see our history with them is different from the group that is opposing the view. He said, we weren't hurt by them. They didn't do anything wrong with us. They treated us well, and we treated them well. We have different views, and we're going to go. Now, that is the 6th Panzer Division, was Sepp Dietrich, Fritz Kramer, Otto Skorzeny, and Joachim Peiper. And they're going to have their semi-annual reunion if they don't meet more often. And it's just ridiculous to see Wiesenthal speak up now. for my part, he's been completely neutralized for many, many years. He's a laughing representative of nothing. And what he says isn't listened to any more than Elie Wiesel at the White House. They never were listened to, and they never will be. And the Waffen-SS will meet the United States veterans, and they'll celebrate more every year now that Reagan has made this group kosher by visiting their graves with Helmut Kohl and Richard von Weizsäcker. Now we'll take a 1-minute break and then go on to some other important news stories, and I'll continue along the lines updating some of these horrendous little tidbits that go back to things I've tried to explain before. This is Mae Brussell. This is part 2 of World Watchers, the 1-hour broadcast, and I'll continue with a list of information you can send. I can't buy all these books at the present time. I'm going to order quite a large set of them. But I want to give you the address here to send $1 and get a list of material on video cassettes, tape cassettes, books, flags, jewelry, and pamphlets. And the address is Liberty Bell Publications. If I go too fast, just write to me and send a self-addressed stamped envelope. I'll put the information in, or call me. Liberty Bell Publications, P.O. Box 21, Reedy, Reedy, West Virginia 25270. Send $1 and you can get a list of newsletters that are out, or, as I say, stamps or flags. There's books, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, the original edition, short sketches of Adolf Hitler, The Education of a Conservative by Professor R.P. Oliver. He was one of the first executives and founders of the John Birch Society, active with Nazis, Nazi organizations who said the Jews in America had to be vaporized. He gave that at a 4th of July speech. I won't give you the prices of the books and spend time. You can get this material. There is a pamphlet on Auschwitz, an eyewitness report by Thies Christofferson, and the introduction is by Dr. Manfred Roeder, R-O-E-D-E-R. He's the connecting link to the lie that Joseph Mengele is dead, to Hans Ulrich Rudel, the Luftwaffe pilot, to the Mengele operation, the Odessa network, and to the Aryan nations, to Richard Butler and the Nazis that meet up in Idaho. And Butler worked at Lockheed's plant for Lockheed on the U-2 flight material, along with Thane Cesar, the man who really shot Robert Kennedy. When I said that Thane Cesar worked with the American Nazi Party in Riverside, it was about 5 years ago on the air, 6 years ago, people thought that was outrageous. There are articles you can send for by Dr. Goebbels, and quite a few more on by Professor Oliver, Conspiracy or Degeneracy. They range in price from $2, $4, $8. There are books by E.P. Yockey, Y-O-C-K-E-Y, and he was the inspiration behind Willie Carto and Liberty Lobby, who makes this material available for you. There's a book, The Destruction of Dresden, by David Irving. He writes about Nazi Germany from a right-wing point of view. Quite a few things on Yockey and Oliver. There's an article, The Story of the Waffen-SS by Degrelle. Degrelle has become the new person that Simon Wiesenthal wants to get now that he has lied about Joseph Mengele. He wants Degrelle. He has to keep the Institute going for something. And I almost believe with the behavior of these people in the Jewish community that maybe, no, I won't say it, but Willie Carto must have something right. I'll tell you, the way the Jews and the concerned Gentiles respond, it's ridiculous. They have a bulletin here, $1.75 by Matt Cole, member of the Posse Comitatus, who was killed. History and Biology. Professor Avila is a doctor. Henry Ford Sr., he has a 4-volume set on the Jews. A $5 trillion secret, Colonel Dahl, that was Franklin Roosevelt's son-in-law. A lot of material on warfare courses by Commander George Lincoln Rockwell. That was the American Nazi Party before William Pierce took it over. William Pierce had contracts with the Air Force and United Technology, and then went into Rockwell's office. Rockwell and Lee Harvey Oswald, in some way we're familiar. Oswald had his name and telephone number. I don't know that he ever saw him, but they had a lot of friends in common. besides Commander Rockwell and his material, there's a list of about 40 or 50 books. They're very valuable. And then they throw Teddy Bear, The True Story of Chappaquiddick, of course. And they have the price of the book, The UFOs, The Nazi Secret Weapon. It's $7, and it's very valuable. Samizdat publisher combines here with Liberty, maybe because Samizdat was the fellow in charge that Mr. Zundel got a 1.5-year sentence for saying there was no Holocaust. But I've given you the address. You can send for these. There are Third Reich collector items. You can have large flags with a swastika, the Third Reich battle flag, the Luftwaffe flag, the SS headquarters flag. I'm going to order the miniatures. The large ones are $24.50. They're 6 feet square, but I can get the little ones. They're only 1.5 feet, and they have 3 or more colors for $10 each. I can get 3 flags to hang on my front yard if I want. On Hermann Goering's personal standard, the Panzer Division, they have medals and pins. If you want your swastika armbands, they're $5. Stick pins, skull cap badges, Luftwaffe stick pin, and Luftwaffe breast badge, Eagle swastika, belt buckle. You can get all the Nazi memorabilia that is very current for them. You can get the SS skull medallion with a neck chain for only $7. We should have a auction in that you see some of this. You can get material envelope stuffers, 100 of them, to put in your mail for $1.50. Hitler was right. Communism is Jewish. There are excerpts from a speech by Major General Willoughby. There are 100 of them for $1.50, and you can get 1,000 of them for $12. I'll send for that and put that in my correspondence with you, or send it out with a tape. You don't have to bother. As a gift to subscribers, I'll give you from the Nazis in America, Charles Willoughby's speeches. That is Mr. Wiedenbach from the Kriegs Academy, who was Chief of Intelligence for Douglas MacArthur. Many of you know. If you don't know that name, you call me. I've had him on the air so much. The Holocaust Swindle, there's reprints of pamphlets. They're really cheap. You get 20 of them for $1.50, or a complete set, and you get the story of Begin's blood-soaked past, an outline of the prodigals, Fable of the Ducks, and by Commander Rockwell of the American Nazi Party, What Fascism Really Was, and a non-kosher interview with Manak and Bagel. And they have La Via Dolorosa of Simon Wiesenthal. I remember Martin Lucifer Kuhn. Oh, I'm not going to give you all of this. You can get reprints and pamphlets by Professor Oliver, the one that say Jews should be wiped out. You can get Germany and the True Story of the Third Reich, 5 for $1.50. You can get 40 copies of Jews, the Real Sharks for $1.50. You can buy 5 copies of the LSD Murders and Other Terminations with Extreme Prejudice, Kosher Food Racket, Exposed Atrocity Propaganda, and Samizdat Holocaust Trial and Awakening. You can get these pamphlets. You can get large books from $12 to $8. You can buy records, the long-playing record, Survival of the White Race. I'm going to start investing in these. I think this is really interesting. This is something Wiesenthal doesn't talk about very much. You notice? You can buy video cassettes for $50, The Triumph of the Will. I suppose that's G. Gordon Liddy speaking German. Then you get marching tapes, the Horst Wessel. You can get the German marching tapes, and you can get speeches of Commander George Lincoln Rockwell at his alma mater, Brown University. Did you know that George Lincoln Rockwell, the head of the American Nazi Party, went to Brown University? And you can buy the soundtrack of the Nazi rallies. There's some in foreign languages, and I don't think many of my listeners would want that. The Hoax of the 20th Century, that's only $7. The fact that there was no Holocaust. And the 4 books of Henry Ford you can get combined for $35 for around $2,000, maybe $1,000. You'd know what's going on in America. But this goes out mass printed, and I'm going to start sending for some of this. I have a little bit, but not enough, and I'll share this with you. Now, going to another subject, but not separate from it, I was down in Los Angeles this past week, and of course the newspaper was all filled with the Louis Farrakhan visit. I was going to the forum in Inglewood, and people that I knew told me that the tickets were sold out. I found out later, I think they were diverting me from going because there was supposed to be a place for 18,000. I don't think there were that many. But Farrakhan came into Los Angeles for his first major speech after receiving $5 million from Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi has a new peace alliance with the King of Morocco. The public relations firm in charge of King of Morocco is Robert Keith Gray, and the former ambassador at large, going back and forth with Vernon Walter. These are the two highest spooks. Vernon Walters, of course, being a representative of the Knights of Malta and the intelligence community all of his career. He's now ambassador to the UN. So money is poured from Gaddafi, and I think it came directly from the CIA funds, and they were going to test the waters of Mayor Bradley just in case he wanted to run against Mr. Deukmejian as governor again, or for political purposes. So they dumped Farrakhan in Los Angeles and said, okay, Bradley, do you go along with the Jews or do you denounce Farrakhan? And he made a deal with Louis Farrakhan. If I'm not hard on you, will you tone down on the Jews because there's a lot of Jews in this town? And so he claims he toned Farrakhan a little bit, and Farrakhan was speaking at the forum, and he is plenty intelligent. Don't underestimate Louis Farrakhan. And he said, if I'm telling a lie, correct me, and if I'm telling the truth, you better listen to me. And this is what I say all the time on World Watchers. If I'm telling you a lie, write to me, correct me, find the information that's wrong. But if I'm telling the truth, you better wake up out there, because time's running out, and these guys have a lot of money and a lot of muscle. He calls Judaism a dirty religion. He didn't this last week during the campaign. He broke up the Democratic Party when Jesse Jackson was his friend by saying it was a dirty religion and Hitler was a great man. But he did say that he is against the idea that the Jews say they're the chosen people. He said in his speech, I have a problem with the Jewish people, not because I'm hateful of Jewish people, but because I have declared to the world they are not the chosen people of God. As far as he's concerned, he's as much chosen as the Jews. Now, just this last year, I had some quotations on the air from the play The Portage to San Cristobal of Adolf Hitler by George Steiner. It came out in 1979, Simon & Schuster, and this was the story of the Mossad, 5 or 6 agents capturing Hitler in the jungle in Brazil and realizing there never would be a trial, and how Hitler defended himself in the last act of the play. He gives a 35-minute speech. Some of you remember it, or some of you may not have heard it, but in this particular play, and I've never read it straight through with you, Hitler's speech, but it's totally brilliant, and he defends himself by saying, I understand where you get your secret power. The secret power of your teaching, of yours, that you're a chosen people, chosen by God for his own. And the minute you think you are chosen, you have secret power. And he says all of that is lies. To believe that you, and this is the year 5,900 and something, I should know. The Jewish New Year began last night, but I don't remember as the years roll on, because they're old enough to know better for what they're doing. Arming the dictatorships, Nicaragua, South Africa, Argentina, feeding the Nazi governments throughout the world. Maybe you know I lost interest in that a long time ago. But in the role of the man playing Adolf Hitler that Steiner has, he says that you promised for eternity you would rule the world. And Hitler says, I was only going to be here for 1,000 years, and you throw in eternity. So you have to get rid of your holy books because they smell of blood. And Hitler is saying that when people think they're chosen to fill their destiny, then everyone else has to be killed. And you've chosen, he says to the Mossad agents, a mysterious single person called God that you can't see or look up to in terms of being a being. And this unknown thing creates everything you do. And he went on to say that you use the sword, that you slaughter the city because of an idea, because of a vexation over words, and that you alter the human soul and invent one leader, a Moses or Joshua or somebody who you can't see. And from there you set everyone apart, and you choose, to call them the Goyim. That's what the Jews do. They call Gentiles Goyim. The Jews set themselves apart. That's an important thing that is not in this play, but someday I want to write about it, is the separation of the German Jew to the Eastern European Jew. They considered them dirt and didn't care if they died. They really thought that Hitler was doing a favor, and this has never yet, at least I haven't seen it explained in literature, but I grew up with it. The difference between a German Jew and an Eastern European Jew. And they thought themselves apart. And of course, in the Orthodox Church temple, the men can't sit with the women. Just tragically, this past week in Krakow, you might have read about the bar mitzvah, where the entire Jewish community is dying, and there's a handful of older people, and they said, would you send us a bar mitzvah so we could see a young person, doing this ceremony over again as we did it when we were young. And it's an Orthodox synagogue, and they wanted to hear the service. And then the Americans had the nerve to send a very handsome young man with a female rabbi. And females sit upstairs, separate from men. They can't sit with men in the Orthodox Church, in the Orthodox temple. And they sent this rabbi, was a woman, which is so offensive to the tradition. These are old people that are dying. This is what Jews do to each other. If the U.S. Information Service or Voice of America answered the needs of Ronald Reagan and said, okay, you want a service, we'll send your rabbi, and they sent a woman, it would be a dirty anti-Semitic trick. But in this case, the Jews brought a female rabbi and hurt each other. And Farrakhan, I don't believe, can hurt the Jews as much as they are hurting each other. And what he's saying, he should be listened to because he is very important to the American scene and what's going to happen in this country. Now, Mayor Bradley was castigated. The L.A. Herald had a large story, September 14th, by Harvey Schechter. Mayor Bradley, why didn't you speak out against hate? They describe Harvey Schechter as the regional director of the Pacific Southwest of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. Do you ever hear Harvey Schechter talk about the Aryan nations? Is he a household word with you, talking about Richard Butler or Manfred Roeder or Karl-Heinz Hoffmann, the fellow I was talking about last week, and what is going on in Germany and Europe and in the United States, or this organization that publishes all the literature that Germany had, arming us with the badges, the armbands, the flags, the jewelry, the real costumes, the clothes, the books, the tapes, the videos. Where is Mr. Schechter? No, it's racism pure and simple. He's picking on a black mayor, dividing this country and dividing the city of Los Angeles because it's very powerful in electing future presidents and people that run this country. Now, you never hear Mr. Schechter talk about the Coalition for Peace Through Strength that I want to talk about next week, the religious fundamentalists. Did these Jews ever take Ronald Reagan and George Bush apart when their darling Reverend Falwell said that the Jews were going to burn in hell, that we're going to have this time where they're separated in this tribulation? Do they ever talk about that powerful Coalition of Peace Through Strength and the people on like John Singlau with his Nazi, Waffen-SS connections in the World Anti-Communist League, or with General Lyman Lemonster? As part of that, he covered up with Ronald Reagan the CIA investigation of the murder of the President of the United States that did involve Nazis, South American and European Nazis. They're picking on a black man, and the whole issue is to spread Farrakhan, to break them apart and check their hypocrisy, and it works. And, of course, the big articles by these Jewish writers is pathetic in its conversation in L.A. for a black mayor to be picked apart by a person who's telling you that I am as much chosen as they are. Now, he's absolutely right. Nobody cares what Falwell says, and I think Farrakhan is chosen to be a god as much as any one that the Jews think is their god. If you think you are, you are, and that's all he's saying. You gave us the idea. That's what Mr. Steiner said in the play. You gave us the idea, and we're taking it. Now, enjoying that whole Farrakhan scene in Los Angeles, between Mayor Bradley, who used to work with the Los Angeles Police Department when Patty Hearst was kidnapped, and played a very political role in he worked with, as mayor and in the police department, with the people who set up the kidnapping. Donald DeFries, who was a member of the police department, and Squad 19, and all those things were his agencies before he became mayor. But eating all this up was George Bush in Los Angeles, and as I say, Robert Keith Gray, William Casey, and the whole gang, I believe, are behind this whole operation with Gaddafi and Farrakhan. So there's a picture of the L.A. Herald, Governor Deukmejian and Vice President Bush going to a barbecue. Bush is smiling. It's called California Dreaming. Bush Duke ticket in '88, while the blacks are fighting each other out. Farrakhan and Tom Bradley are fighting it out. Then that wasn't enough. In the same picture, they had another picture of George Bush. VP visits L.A. Vice President Bush speaks, to officials at Universal Studio. Is that what he came for that week, to go to Universal Studio? Or when Farrakhan was there, while they were having their confrontation of what the mayor should do, right next to the picture of Bush is the story, Mayor Tom Bradley has decided to keep an agreement in a private meeting with local black leaders to withhold comment of controversial Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan until after Farrakhan gives a planned speech. And it says Bradley keeps agreement to stay silent, and next to it is the picture of George Bush. Then another picture of George Bush in the paper holding a shirt, this time from the next day. Senor Bush takes to the streets to Olivera Street. He went to Universal Studios. Then he goes down where the poorest people are eating the greasiest food in the worst tourist trap in the United States, probably, and holds up a shirt, George Bush 88. The best thing about Olivera Street is that little candied lollipops are made of clear sugar. They're triangle-shaped, and you lick them. If you chew them, you break your teeth, even when you're young. And there's certain things I like about it, the Mexican dresses and so forth. George Bush is down there at Olivera Street enjoying the mayor's struggle. The city hall is just a few blocks away. Now, jumping away from George Bush, and I want to get back to him in 1 second, or I may as well do it right now. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, is being picked on a little now, getting ready, maybe with his physical condition, to get rid of him in a psychological way, and George Bush, the former director of CIA, would slide himself in. And so along with this, Washington Post, September the 1st, is a story by David Broder. Scholars of the presidency find Reagan hard to reckon. And it goes on, there's a big box. Reagan has a much greater capacity for governing. He is opting for current popularity rather than a place of history which would be impregnable. And they don't understand why he wouldn't go for that place in history. Then it goes into a discussion. There was a conference where at the University of California, where various professors got together from Berkeley and Davis and Stanford to talk about the mind of Ronald Reagan. Now, this may have been going on when the other men were in office, but I don't quite remember the same kind of a subject. It's dated New Orleans, August 31st. To one professor from Berkeley, Reagan is an old actor living his favorite movie roles. To another, he's a political strategist who has flummoxed the Democrats. To the University of California colleague from Davis, he's the most successful political leader since Roosevelt. A scholar from Stanford asserts there is no Teflon protecting Reagan, while a professor from George Washington wonders how a person so unattentive to detail, so ignorant of facts, so disengaged, and so willing to delegate can be viewed as a success by the public and by the Washington power brokers. 4 scholars who voted for Reagan, all voted for him, agreed in a panel discussion he did little to establish the intellectual or political base for any long-term conservative dominance, while others find it ironic that while Calvin Coolidge's portrait hangs in the White House, Reagan spends his second term political capital in the Capitol defending Social Security and relics of the New Deal. And the article is deciding on the mentality of Ronald Reagan, and a conclusion of one of the members, Norman Thomas, of the University of Cincinnati, my assessment is schizophrenic, that Reagan is schizophrenic. And it goes on to say there's a lot of company in that regard. And this is a long article chewing him apart, what they like about him, don't like about him, but even, as I say, calling him schizophrenic, and wondering just where he's going and what is he doing. And they're analyzing a president in power who was just reelected with a former director of the CIA as vice president and sort of laying his brains out on a table and discussing the man. Now, George Bush can't be taken lightly as the CIA director, and as problems mount, Reagan isn't addressing them. So pretty soon there's going to be a push and shove about what this administration is about. He first ran on the pledge to balance the budget and get rid of the debt. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times has a story September the 11th, this past Wednesday. Many of you might have seen in your newspapers. The administration asked Congress to raise the debt ceiling to $2.078 trillion by October the 15th. I was at a dinner party several weeks ago where I mentioned that our debt was going to $2 trillion, the president wanted it, and a young person there said that's not true. Where are my sources? He argued with me, and I said, I'll mail you this story, and he said, don't do it. He didn't want it. No, if I was right, he didn't want the information. Struggle with that one. That's the kind of way people handle. I might have told you the story last week. The way they handle news is don't show me, I'll live with my fantasies. You know, this is the problem, one of the problems in the United States, because it's happening with educated people. So after this, that was on a Saturday night, and the following Wednesday, there was this story. The Reagan administration on Tuesday asked Congress to raise the national debt above the $2 trillion, saying that without the new borrowing authority, the United States Treasury would be broke by October the 15th. That's 1 month, less than 1 day, yes, a month from this past month, ahead rather, but this is September 15th, 16th rather, October the 15th, less than a month, the Treasury will be broke. John J. Niehenke, Niehenke, acting Assistant Treasury Secretary for Domestic Finance, told the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Taxation and Debt Management that the debt limit was merely a recognition of obligations the government has already made, and he told the Congressional Committee that we spend $170 billion a year, more than half of what the Treasury collects in income taxes from individuals is paid to service the debt. We feed the debt $170 billion a year, and we take in half of that. Just half of that to pay from our income taxes, and you might have read about the top corporations in the United States that pay no taxes at all. And where is the Grace Commission and the other group where they get off paying the taxes, and we're putting people in employment or buying our products overseas so that Americans aren't earning money and can't put taxes into it, such as steel and clothing and fabric and shoes. And you know the controversies going on. If you don't earn, you can't pay your taxes, and more people are getting out of those jobs. There is greater employment, Ronald Reagan says, but if you see it's the grannies at the fried chicken places and at McDonald's and Jack in the Box, and they can work for $2 to $3 eventually an hour. They may be employed, but what's going into the tax bracket, and they probably have Social Security behind them. Now, behind Ronald Reagan, again, as his vice president, our CIA director, George Bush, eating his tacos down on Olivero Street in Los Angeles and going to Universal Studio to give his little presentation or appearance. There were 2 articles by William Safire, and I want to share particularly the second one because it has to do with George Bush and E.F. Hutton. And I'll go through it quickly. I won't have enough time to do the whole thing. I hoped I would. In an article May 14th, he talks about Scott Pierce working for E.F. Hutton, who replaced George Ball and took over when E.F. Hutton was in dire problems of being investigated, and that Pierce is the sister of Barbara Bush, the brother-in-law of George Bush, and he took over as head of E.F. Hutton as the investigation heated up, and that was in May. Now, this past week, William Safire had a story in the New York Times, the L.A. Herald, the E.F. Hutton case. You can't commit a felony without a felon. And he goes into the fact how U.S. former Attorney General Griffin Bell let E.F. Hutton people off the hook for their check hiding. They were writing and giving loans to people into the billions of dollars. The people happen to be mafia and organized crime, among other things, such as the Boston Bank and the Continental Illinois and Chicago. And Ed Meese lied about the amount of people that got immunity, and Safire talks about that. Then he talked about a luncheon that William French Smith had at a restaurant in Washington with Robert Foman, F-O-M-O-N, of E.F. Hutton. But the important thing was that the luncheon was set up by a man named Upshur Moorhead. Moorhead was an advance man for George Bush. He was an aide to George Bush who left George Bush to work for E.F. Hutton and arranged a luncheon with the Attorney General and the agent, Mr. Foman, from Hutton. So the point of this story is that George Bush's brother-in-law, became the president of E.F. Hutton to replace Mr. Ball. And George Bush's advance man, it wasn't enough that one relative was involved, but the advance man became the man who set up the liaison between the Justice Department and E.F. Hutton. And after the luncheon, the case was literally dropped, and nobody was to be prosecuted, and they cut a deal. Now, this article by Sapphire says the criminal division of the Justice Department brought in E.F. Hutton's defense team, including lawyer William Hundley, to take care of the defense of E.F. Hutton when they cut a deal. If you read the book Spooks by Jim Hogan, or any Watergate book, I'm just citing Hogan now, he tells about William Hundley. He worked on the part of the Get Hoffa squad, and remember Jackie Presser, the Teamsters got off, and they got rid of Hoffa officially by being killed, and Raymond Donovan, Secretary of Labor, was involved hiring a man who killed Jimmy Hoffa. William Hundley was the attorney for John Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States. That was his client. He worked for Jim Neal, one of the Hoffa prosecutors, and he also, Hundley represented the people who prosecuted John Mitchell and Marie Stans, and they got off with a light prosecution tied to the Vesco Committee. And, of course, Vesco is floating around and still has ties to the United States government, even though he's down in Cuba. William Hundley was involved in the Justice Department work with Mr. Pelican, who set up Intertel. They took over the Howard Hughes organization when that non-existent, non-seeing person went down to the Bahamas and left Las Vegas. Hundley is a man who is privy to all the top secrets, just as the top attorneys. I'm thinking of Edward Bennett Williams, that kind of attorney who knows, or F. Lee Bailey, and some of these CIA attorneys who know so much. So the E.F. Hutton story was covered up. No men were prosecuted. And our future President of the United States, I think he probably will make it, particularly dividing the Democratic Party, George Bush, has a brother-in-law and an aide working with E.F. Hutton from the inside and working with the Justice Department to make sure that none of their dirt comes out in the open. And that will be our future president someday. Well, we're out of time. I'll do more on Bush next week. I want to continue because he is moving to that very high position. He's very visible. Meanwhile, this hour is up, and I'll be back with you. It's Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week.